All right. And yeah, so why don't, thank you all for coming. We've got Darcie Collins here, the CEO of Keep Tahoe Blue, which is a nonprofit that I am personally very enthusiastic about. By the way, Nora Hennings, I'm one of the co-presidents of YPE here in the Bay Area, and I work in solar and love the environment and go up to Tahoe all the time. And I think everybody knows the Keep Tahoe Blue stickers, but it's always exciting to actually get to engage with Darcie and with the organization to hear a bit more about what they are doing and what's, and how that can extend to both our experience in Tahoe and also just in the world beyond too, because I know the organization has been a leader in some of the scientific research that they do at the lake and influencing lakes around the world. And so super excited to have Darcie here. For those who were able to join last year, Darcie did this talk a couple months into COVID. So I'm really excited to hear about how things have changed over the last year since our world has changed a lot. So Darcie, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks for the entire YPE team for inviting me back. I am very excited to continue this conversation and to share some of the things that have happened in the past year. Just to make sure, do you see my slide on the screen? Perfect. Okay. So I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to chat with some of you a year ago. Probably, I think the conversation was almost exactly a year ago this week, or this month at least. And although we didn't get to meet in person then, as we're meeting virtually now, we did have an opportunity to look at the early impacts of COVID and COVID-related, pandemic-related regulations on the environment, and specifically how they impacted a case study that we looked at, which was, of course, Lake Tahoe. And the years gone by, and we've learned quite a bit from the changes that the world is experiencing. And what I want to have the opportunity to chat with you all about today is what lessons have we learned, and how can we take the positive lessons and continue to make progress on protecting the environment, and what things can we continue to learn that have been challenges that we might be able to overcome. So for those of you who joined me last time, this was a slide that I showed that was very current at the time. It depicted some great visuals of what we were experiencing from COVID and pandemic-related regulations. And we saw that places that were usually very crowded were experiencing some relief from the crowds, and a lot of people weren't able to go to the places that they normally visit. And so our natural areas got a break. And I think probably the most impactful visuals were that of the clearing of smoggy areas in our urban areas, and just the visual and the ability to so quickly see that our air conditions could improve. And we also talked about areas more close to home. This is a picture of Los Angeles from about a year ago, with the smoggy skies completely cleared. I think a lot of people didn't even realize that the San Gabriel Mountains were so close to downtown Los Angeles. And we've had a year to kind of look at the data from our pollution indicators, and to look at trends, and to see if we really were having a better air quality during that time. And we found that human-related emissions from industry and transportation fell drastically during lockdowns. And 65% of our global cities, specifically in the urbanized areas, experienced better air quality in 2020 compared to 2019. And I think about 84% of nations polled reported air quality improvements. And there was a 45% drop in areas that were not rural, and there were more clear skies, and smoggy areas cleared up. But we found that things quickly returned to pre-pandemic levels. Flights that were canceled, cruise ships, vacations scrapped, there were carbon emissions that plummeted. We also talked about wildlife sightings in areas that hadn't seen wildlife in a while. But looking back, were those clear skies and smoggy areas, were those trends consistent? And looking back, not only in the actual visuals that we experienced, looking at the data, we saw that the trends quickly went back to pre-pandemic baselines as restrictions relaxed. And you can see that depicted here in some of the pollution indexes over China. 2021, just recently in February, very similar to 2019. And some of the other impacts from the pandemic and related regulations and needs were very obvious. Our single-use health-related items, such as gloves and masks, they're apparent everywhere. And a lot of the progress that we have made over the past decades in diminishing our reliance on the use of single-use items has almost completely been reversed. And there are other impacts that were less obvious, like the lack of tourism in numerous areas wreaked havoc on undeveloped countries. Poaching increased substantially in many areas because park rangers and other staff weren't able to get out and protect the animals. And it seems that to make progress on addressing these environmental threats, it's going to take a more sustained and systematic effort than just not doing things for a few months. So what did we learn? What can we expect in terms of long-term impacts, both good and bad? So I kind of gave you a picture of some of those short-term, really positive impacts that we were seeing, but then there's some long-term impacts that may maintain for a while. And it's going to depend on how COVID evolves. We're going to learn more about its mutation and how it spreads and how people respond to that change. And that'll really decide how long-term these impacts, especially the negative ones, are going to be. And are people going to continue to have discomfort with public safety? What are their comfort with safety, health safety being out in the public? How are their travel patterns going to change? Are we going to continue working from home? Are we going to continue to use one-time single-use items, or can we go back to using reusables? Are there going to be consistent trends in how we purchase things remotely? Maybe we're changing our habits and patterns in going to the grocery store. Maybe we are more thoughtful about one-stop shopping rather than going out numerous times in public. Those trends we'll continue to learn about as they evolve over the years. Things like the quantity of masks and plastic products like the PPEs, the personal protective equipment, the kits, the face shields, the chemicals, a lot of that's going to continue to be generated as waste into the near future. But on the positive side, it's not all doom and gloom. We've all rediscovered, or many of us have rediscovered, the wonder of nature, and we have a renewed appreciation. And we noted just by the quick response our environment and our air quality had, that nature is resilient. And if we give it time to do so, it can rebound. And that's one of the biggest lessons I think we learned during the pandemic. And it demonstrated that people can, by making certain decisions, help heal the environment. But it's going to take commitment and planning. And it's also going to take a reliance on science. And we had proof that rapid and radical action is possible, but are we able to sustain it? 2020 has seen some normalization of some pretty troubling behaviors that can derail our actions that are based on climate science. Experts in government on all levels and the traditional media have been systematically attacked by the Trump administration. So trust in both expertise and science has diminished. So we have a big challenge of rebuilding that trust. We've seen a lot of conspiracy theories wrapped up in this country's response to the pandemic, and I have a feeling that's not going away. And that could be hard for us as we're trying to formulate and implement rational science-based policy, particularly as it relates to the environment. So what we have, not different from challenges we've had before, but maybe kind of exacerbated by what we've experienced over this last year, is we have to rebuild a trust in science as well as our critical thinking. So let's go back to our Tahoe case study that we looked at a year ago, for those of you that were with me. and look at some ideas of how on a microcosm we have tried to reverse some of the negative trends we've seen over the year and continue to make progress towards protecting the lake. And we have learned a lot from some of the challenges that COVID has presented. Lake Tahoe is changing like the rest of the world, but our commitment at Keep Tahoe Blue is not. In our solution, we're a solution-based oriented, and our solutions to reaching our mission of keeping Tahoe blue is to be action-oriented. And as I mentioned, COVID presented some challenge over this past year, but it also gave us some opportunities. One of those challenges is this single-use trash that I mentioned earlier. It's become the new litter, not just in Tahoe, but all over the world, but we definitely saw an increase in these types of products. We do a lot of our work, our community engagement work, based on data collection. So we provide a ton of volunteer opportunities. One of the most popular is our trash pickups. And we've been doing those for almost 10 years now. And we make sure that all of our volunteers collect information about the trash that they're picking up. So we can learn a lot about what's out there. And we got some pretty impressive data on the amount of masks and other COVID-related items that we picked up throughout 2020 into 2021. And in 2020 alone, we picked up, with the help of our volunteers, over 1,200 masks. There were 1,200, about 1,500 total. So we had coordinated cleanup efforts, and then we have a program which I'll discuss a little bit later called Tahoe Blue Cruise. And between the two of those, we collected over 1,200 masks. We picked up other related items such as gloves and wipes and other single-use items that were COVID related. So for the total in 2020, we had over 2,000 COVID related items. And in 2021 so far, in just a short amount of time, we've picked up over 1,000 masks and about 200 other COVID-related items. So a lot more of these single-use items are being found, unfortunately. So Tahoe's taking a beating from the impacts of different type of tourism. I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits from our stay-at-home orders and our restrictions, COVID-related restrictions we were all experiencing, is that our neighbors, our regional neighbors from Tahoe, took the opportunity to come and visit. And some of them were new tourists, they were new visitors, and they hadn't been here before, and they were day users, and they didn't necessarily have a connection to Tahoe that some of you have been visiting Tahoe for a while had. So we saw a huge increase in impact, specifically with trash, but other impacts on our minimal services at our parks. A lot of those areas weren't open. We didn't have a lot of the restrooms open because our park managers, like they were throughout the world, were not working so that they can stay safe and healthy. And so this impact was evident. But on the flip side of that, our community engagement programs were hugely successful. And that's not just in what we were able to accomplish on the ground, but the amount of volunteers that wanted to participate demonstrated that people want to be part of the solution. So for every individual, every visitor that didn't necessarily treat Tahoe well, there was a visitor or local that wanted to do something to protect Tahoe and to reverse those impacts. So we continued our cleanup work and our community engagement work, shifting it a bit. I think I talked about last year how we were just starting to gear up some of our virtual programs and our virtual training so that we could launch programs that would keep our volunteers and our staff safe, but allow us to continue to do some of the important community engagement work. One of those programs that I alluded to earlier was our Tahoe Blue Crew program. We'd had this idea prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic had us kind of launch it into quick implementation. And the idea is that instead of these typical one-day beach cleanups where we have hundreds of volunteers at different sites, individuals can sponsor a blue crew, and that crew can adopt an area, and that area will benefit from the crews becoming stewards of that land. So they'll do beach cleanup, they'll collect data on things like invasive species, and they'll really steward the area that they're adopting. We had 8 crews at the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic, and to date we have over 90 crews that have adopted a variety of areas throughout the lake. We had a huge impact on addressing some of these negative leftover remnants from visitors. One thing that's been an issue and it increased this last winter was trash from sled hills. A lot of people come up to Tahoe for a quick day trip to visit our sledding hills during the winter, and their debris left behind. But we had over 6 tons of trash collected by our volunteers during our cleanups of these various sledding areas. We picked up throughout that season over 4,000 pounds of litter. With our Blue Crew program, we've had over 200 cleanups. And like I said, we collect information on what type of trash is left behind. And this is interesting to compare through the years, but it's also very important data to help us convince change in policy. So if we have this information, we can convince our policymakers to make decisions like banning single-use plastic bags, which we were able to do a handful of years ago. And we picked up over that season over 17,000 plastic items. And we had 11 winter hotspots adopted by our great Blue Crew volunteers. We continued to do that same work throughout the summer. And for all those negative headlines you may have seen from the impacts of visitors last year and through the winter, we can counteract them with these positive headlines with our Blue Crews being stewards and picking up after other visitors. So in relationship to this doubt of science-based decision-making, we really focus a lot of our work on citizen science. So the intent is to help people process information and help to change social behavior, gain trust in science again, rebuild that trust, but to actually have our volunteers be scientists. This can help them learn more about what the impacts are, and it helps them find alignment with different values that they align with in their environmental goals and their environmental values. I use the Tahoe Blue Crews, those crews that adopt certain areas as an example, but we have numerous other programs. One of them is our Pipe Keepers program. And you could see these volunteers are members of that program. It's a little more intensive program, but volunteers help us collect information on what is flowing into the lake. So what kind of pollutants, including sediment, go into the lake, so we can monitor what pipes are the most polluting and look at trends over the years. We also have a program called Eyes on the Lake, where we train volunteers to identify invasive species so that we can find hotspots and then work with our land partners to decide what areas are most important to start invasive species removal and other control methods. So all of these programs and everything that you do can help you be what we call a Tahoe Blue Gooder. So it gives every individual the opportunity to protect the lake. Whether you're a pipe keeper, have a more intensive relationship with our programs, or if you just take the pledge. I put on this slide in the right-hand corner some of our mantras that will help anybody become a Tahoe Blue Gooder. Just taking care of Tahoe while you enjoy it. If you're seeing the trash, pick it up. Keeping your car parked, trying to use friendly alternatives, spreading the word, other things that are very important to not just protecting Tahoe, but protecting the environment. And seeing these impacts that were exacerbated by our increased visitation from people fleeing their homes and trying to escape not just the heat in the surrounding areas, which as climate in our valleys continue to increase temperatures over the past decade, we've seen an increase in visitation. And that was compounded last year with people coming to Tahoe as a refuge from COVID. So if we have this messaging and we start to model the behavior we want to see, it can help having a long-lasting positive impact. Our citizen science programs, we partner with UC Davis and other institutes that give you an opportunity to just use a simple app on your phone. And you could become a citizen scientist just by signing up, and all of the information is on that app. Gives a great opportunity to learn more about the environment and help us collect important data. So those are just some things that we've excelled at and we were able to kind of address during COVID on a smaller scale. But I think the importance is really starting at a grassroots level, bringing people back into the fold to trust science, to conduct science on their own, and to really make decisions based on the best science. And of course, what's the lake? What lake that would you prefer to enjoy? That lake on the right or that lake on the left? And I'm assuming we all want to see that lake on the right. And that's what we're going to continue to do through all of these efforts with the holistic approach of working with science-based solutions and getting volunteers in our community engaged and boots on the ground. I'm happy to open it up for discussion now because I think that's where we'll really have a great conversation. I'd like to hear from you, things you've experienced, questions you may have, thoughts on what you've learned over the past year in terms of how COVID-related regulations have impacted your life or your daily experiences. Have you noticed that you have been doing more things to protect the environment, or have things become more relaxed because of focusing on other issues or challenges in your life? Nora, maybe you can facilitate the Q&A, or just any comments. Doesn't even have to be a question. Just would love to hear from everyone on what you've experienced over the past year.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Darcie. We did get a comment in the chat from Igor, who's saying thank you for the presentation, but also saying that California legislators continue to reject single-use plastic bans and other plastic controls. What lessons can be gleaned from what you're doing in Tahoe so that we can hold the elected representatives more accountable?
Is a great question. We are very involved. We've been very involved in lobbying for those two pieces of legislation that you identified. And it's unfortunate that they haven't made progress. I think I wouldn't say, though, that it's necessarily anything to worry about at this time, because so much of our decision making over the past year shifted from status quo to COVID-related prep, and whether it's a response or trying to be proactive. I think we're primed for success in those areas in the next year. And having success cases like what has been successful in the Bay Area and even in Tahoe will really help in pushing that along. The only thing, though, is we definitely have had a setback in the public's trust in those items. We had that period where we thought COVID spread in a different way than we've learned. So I think there might be a little bit more of a hurdle than we would have had to convince the public that it's safe to use reusable items like your grocery bag that you take to the market on your own. But we had that challenge before, so we'll overcome it. It did put us back a little bit, but I think we'll get there.
Awesome. And another one in the chat, do you collaborate with other organizations focused on lake or nature preservation? And if so, in what ways do you collaborate?
Another good question. Collaboration is the key. We can't do anything on our own. League to Save Lake Tahoe, Keep Tahoe Blue. We've been around for 65 years, so we're the oldest environmental organization in Tahoe, but we are in no way the only partner that has been working on environmental conversations and environmental issues. We work very closely with our agency partners, state level agencies, local jurisdictions, and other nonprofits that are implementing solutions. And that having that holistic approach is the only way that we can make progress, not just in Tahoe, but on a state level. Our organization works both locally and at a state level. We're participating in a lot of state conversations because people do look to Tahoe as a model. And a lot of the things we've done in the past haven't been successful. So we like to share our successes as well as our challenges and failures. One reason why it's so important that we collaborate in Tahoe is we have such a unique political setup. We're situated between two states. There's numerous local jurisdictions. The Forest Service actually owns and manages over 80% of the land in the Lake Tahoe Basin. So working together to coordinate all of those protective measures is vital. And this last year was another great example of the importance of coordination. Not unlike elsewhere, one of our biggest challenges was we have so many land managers at state, federal, local levels, and they were making decisions as they learned more about the pandemic and its impacts that were maybe different than their neighboring land partners. So you had state parks closing their parks a certain date, and you had the Forest Service maybe keeping theirs open a little longer. So pressures were moving. And we helped lead an effort to put together a collaborative conversation amongst all of the land and decision makers in Tahoe so that we could coordinate those closures and openings. It didn't happen right away when we first went into lockdown, but since that time, we've done a much better job up here in coordinating decisions and making sure that if one state park's going to open, its timing is in lockstep with its neighboring partner.
Darcie, can you also mention, I know Keep Tahoe Blue has some sister lakes and other organizations globally that you touch with beyond just, the local organizations. Can you mention some of those as well?
Sure. Yeah, on a global level, I mentioned Tahoe's often looked at as a model, both state and nationally, but we've also been working to share our lessons with other with other countries and other partners internationally. Our oldest partner, the oldest partnership is with Lake Baikal in Siberia. And in the late 80s, early 90s, we formed an exchange program called the Tahoe Baikal Institute, which looked at exchanging environmental conservation lessons between the two lakes and the two systems, as well as cultural and environmental policy. And that program was the cornerstone of that program was a 12-week exchange program between scientists and students from both Russia and from the United States that had done work on either Tahoe or Lake Baikal. And for years, that program's been put on pause the past handful of years, but for over 20 years, there was that exchange program. And it was such a great opportunity to learn lessons and to share failures, and not just on environmental protection, but also from a science perspective. I was involved in that program, both as a participant and then on the board. And one of the things that I studied was in Tahoe, we looked at a reintroduction of a locally extinct species of trout, the Lahontan cutthroat trout. We were trying to reintroduce that back to Tahoe. And then there was a similar project at Lake Baikal. We were trying to introduce an endangered species of bird. So there's a lot of lessons there that we were able to exchange. And it was also very interesting because there was the cultural exchange. So that wasn't just limited to what we were experiencing in Tahoe, but what we were experiencing in the two countries. And we also have partnerships, numerous other places throughout the world, but I think an example of one of our other stronger partnerships is with the lake region in northern Patagonia in Chile. We just helped start a nonprofit there that's kind of modeled on the Keep Tahoe Blue model, which is a private sector nonprofit, but working with their science research institute partners and their government partners, because they're experiencing increased tourism in that region. It's kind of maybe 30, 40 years behind what we've experienced. So we can help them maybe avoid some of the issues that we experienced and to implement things early. It's a great opportunity to share lessons on both science side, ecology side, as well as what's been successful in conservation.
Awesome. And speaking of tourism, we have a couple questions around housing. I know there's a group here that is listening in that has moved up to Tahoe and mentioned that everyone bought up really quickly and that it seems like short-term rentals and tenants are kind of unchecked, but then also everyone seems to want to move to Tahoe And so is the housing stock increasing, and what does that actually look like? And I know you made some comments before we started, Darcie, as well about the benefits of people actually moving and living long-term in Tahoe. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, to the new locals, welcome. I know that there might be some initial hesitancy to welcome new people to Tahoe, but I think it's the best thing that could happen to us. A lot of our housing inventory has been historically, at least in the past couple of decades, used as not just second homes, but as vacation rentals. And that brings a different type of individual to Tahoe, and it makes our job of community engagement and education just a revolving door. So we have a continual population that we have to educate. So bringing a bigger population of full-time residents is, I think, going to exponentially help us in our efforts to protect the lake. And for those of you who were on earlier, we kind of talked about this, but we need to really continue to develop this ethos, this culture of Tahoe blue-gooders. And it's much harder to do when you have just a couple of minutes to a couple of hours with an individual. But if we have more of a long-term population that can buy in and model good behavior, it's going to change the behavior of those that visit Tahoe. And it also, I think, helps us bring in innovation and new ideas. Tahoe is a model in some ways, and we were very innovative back in the 60s and 70s when we were newbies to the environmental movement and kind of helped spawn the environmental movement. But now some of our things are a little archaic, especially things like our transit and transportation system. So bringing in new blood and new support in that long-term commitment to Tahoe through long-term residency, I think will really help us have quicker progress in some of those areas we've been stagnant. And then in terms of our housing inventory, it's having more full-time residents move to Tahoe hasn't necessarily been a huge impact on our housing for locals, because we've always, or at least as of recent, we've had a shortage of housing, because a lot of the homes were still being used either as second homes or as vacation rentals. So it's a similar problem that, obviously, as it has most places, the housing prices have gone up. So that definitely makes it difficult for our locals to find long-term housing. But the housing, the solution is not going to be in building new houses, because one of the things we've done to protect Lake Tahoe is to create a max capacity for building houses. So there's only a certain amount of housing that can be built in Tahoe. So we're going to have to be creative in how we figure out how to address the housing shortage. And they'll probably be in figuring out how to take some of these old and ailing motels that we see all over that were built back in the 60s and 70s and turn those into some nice affordable housing complexes. It's not a unique challenge to Tahoe, and the increase in people moving up to Tahoe, I don't think it really exacerbated that problem. And in fact, I'm hoping it helps us find a better solution.
Awesome. Thank you. And another question that has come up is, have you been able to connect with any academic researchers or others involved in the area to highlight some of the impacts of COVID over the last year, specifically during the shutdown, and how has that played out?
Yeah, a lot of my conversations were very narrowly focused on sustainable tourism and sustainable recreation. Conversations that have been started for a while, but really have excelled over this past year because of places like Tahoe that are seeing this huge influx of individuals visiting because of our accessibility and the need for people just to get out in nature. Tahoe is a third of the size of Yosemite, but we receive more than 4 times the amount of visitors every year. And in fact, we receive over 15 million visitors, which is more than the top 3 national parks combined. So we have a huge amount of impact from visitors, but maybe not the infrastructure related to it. So we've been sharing lessons and successes from other areas that have similar issues. And we've brought a lot of experts. Actually, just recently, this past couple of months, we've had a series of virtual conversations with other practitioners in the field that are leading these conversations to give us some ideas of solutions, specifically areas like Iceland, and they've grappled with this conversation in some of the national parks on the East Coast. Other places that have made a lot of progress are Canada. Spain has a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily say they've made progress, but they've been grappling with these conversations and questions for quite a while. Like places like Barcelona have extreme amounts of visitors, and they also have issues with vacation rentals and losing the characteristics of their neighborhoods. So we've started a very intense conversation around what are some of the solutions. Haven't really started to implement anything innovative as of yet, but slow progress, and just looking at what can we do in Tahoe, how can we be coordinated, and what have other areas done to help lessen those impacts.
Awesome. And with that, are you also looking at like transportation infrastructure in addition to things like housing?
Yeah, so for Tahoe, not unlike other places, probably one of the biggest positive impacts we could make on reducing the congestion and associated negative impacts from visitors or just use in general is to get people out of their cars. They're really, at this moment in time, there's very few options to the private automobile. You can't get around the lake on public transit. You can get from smaller regional point A to point B, but there's no way to go around the entire lake if you wanted to do it without your car. So we're looking at creating a system of microtransit, and we've actually done a couple of pilot projects, and there's going to be a huge pilot project on the North Shore this summer. So if anyone's up there, you'll get to experience using these shuttles. The company is Downtowner, and they're going to work by region. So it's free to the rider. You use it based on demand, call them up, they'll pick you up at your house. If you want to go within one region, it'll drop you off. If you want to go between regions, it'll connect you to Tahoe Area Rapid Transit TART, the TART system that has the more streamlined, or the baseline buses that go down the main roads. So hopefully we're going to be able to move a lot more people around, or a lot of people around in that pilot, and then we will look at expanding that throughout the rest of the basin. It seems like an easy solution. We've been trying to get that implemented for a while now. There's a lot of obstacles that we didn't think would be there. The first and foremost was just that even our transit district for a while just did not think that this type of micro or shuttle system would work. So at least we've made progress in getting them over the hump of believing in it. Now we just need to start implementing and showing that it works. Exciting opportunities. I mean, it's not, in those sorts of things, it's not rocket science, or it's not things that haven't been done elsewhere. Just have to figure out how to baby steps to implement it.
Has it been any easier or more difficult to implement given COVID for things like that? Because I would think you get the positive of more people moving there full time, so the benefits of the sort of pressure there, but also all the additional visitors. How has that played out for you guys?
I actually think it's accelerated getting some of these things on the ground. We have, obviously the need is more apparent than ever, but it gave us kind of a year to take a pause on some of the other things we were working on and really focus on addressing the increased visitation. So I think this pilot project that we're seeing on the North Shore is a reflection of what we've been seeing over this past year.
Awesome. And do you ever, sorry.
I was just gonna say, I was a little worried that they wouldn't want to do it this year because of restricting the amount of people on shuttles, and maybe not as many people want to use it. But for better or for worse, especially on the Nevada side this summer, a lot of those, the social distancing wasn't necessarily a hindrance to people coming to visit and experiencing Tahoe. And we saw that the shuttles that were here this summer were packed. So it was proved that it was a success. Whether there was a health risk or not is a different conversation, but people wanted to utilize these services. So even during a pandemic, these services were highly used.
And have you, do you guys look at talking to other for-profit organizations like Airbnb and thinking about how they can contribute to improving or maintaining the environment?
Yeah, there's a lot of local partners that we work with. And one of the stronger partners as of recent, which took a while for us, going back to the collaboration question, kind of took a while to coordinate for various reasons. But one of our biggest partners is the South and the North Tahoe Visitors Authorities. I mean, really, they have the biggest potential to really positively impact how our visitors enjoy Tahoe. And it's important to them. They want Tahoe to be pristine and a place that the right visitor wants to come to. So they've just become a very important partner of ours on the transportation conversation and the trash conversation and all of them. So we've been excited to partner with them and to reach out to all of the audiences and venues that they have access to.
Awesome. And not quite a COVID question, but something we all experienced during, well, all the California folks experienced during COVID was the wildfires last year. And the drought is now all over the news all across the country. How are you guys thinking about the wildfires? And then also, I mean, I guess the drought will impact wildfires, but I would also assume that it impacts the lake itself. And how are you thinking about sort of the next year or in next 5 to 10 years even?
Yeah, so lake levels, for those of you who are up here now or any of you have visited in the past couple of weeks, our lake levels are really low. This has kind of been the trend over the past year. We'll have years of extreme precipitation, although more precipitation is falling as rain than snow. But last year and the year before, we had quite a bit of water in the lake. This year, because it was such a low snow season, our snow melted early and it wasn't a lot. So the lake levels are low. The biggest impact to the lake from those low water levels is the shoreline waters, the shallower waters warm quicker, and it creates an environment that's more hospitable for invasive species to establish. So we're really working on ramping up those programs so that we don't get new populations spreading. And then also important is to make sure we're not getting runoff or improving the filtration of the runoff from our roadways, because sediment from our road is the #1 cause of clarity loss. But in terms of forest management and protecting from catastrophic wildfire, Tahoe has actually been, this is another area where we've been leaders. Transportation, not such a great example, but forest management is a great example. And we've been on the forefront of creating a forest action plan, which is a program that California has started. And we were the first region to complete our forest action plan, which was really because of the collaboration of all of the different agencies in Tahoe. We're just used to having to work together because we all fall under one regulatory agency, something that might be a little newer to other regions. So all of our managers and fire districts work together, including CAL FIRE, work together to create this plan, which is a 10-year action plan. And it has a price tag of about $20 million a year to implement throughout the entire basin. That's both the California and Nevada side, to do work that helps with forest management that will help us with be better prepared for fire prevention. So that includes forest thinning, prioritizing certain areas that are around our urban areas, what we call the wildlife urban interface, and making progress in a very systematic way. So that's one thing we're working on. We've got the plan ready to go. We just need to fund it. We do have some public funding for it, but we're trying to get funding from the state budget to fund at least the first 5 years, but hopefully commitment for 10 years. Obviously, our need is just as important as the rest of the state. So we've got a lot of competition for that funding, but because of our well thought out and pretty in detailed action plan puts us in a pretty competitive position to receive that funding. But it is a scary prospect, because although we have a good plan for forest thinning and preparation for for forest management, we still have a need to really understand how we can move people around in case of a fire. So there's work to be done there, and those conversations are kind of just starting.
And does that plan, I mean, it sounds like it helps with the prevention of fires starting in your area, but if a fire were to start in another area of the Sierras that isn't as prepared, would that plan help assist with putting out the fire, or would the Tahoe area still be
Yeah,
able to-
so that plan is very focused on our region, but it helps us to be prepared in case there are fires in other areas because of the forest thinning and identifying where priority areas to thin. So if there is a fire that comes from another region, we can put it out in the Tahoe area better, and that we have resources here. We also have received quite a bit of grant funding and private funding for a series of fire cameras. So we have almost the basin fully covered in the areas that are needed with cameras that help with early detection if their forest fires are started within the region. So that could help with improving if a fire does start, improving our response time and ability to prevent it becoming catastrophic. And they've started using the model for those cameras that we have here down in certain areas in Southern California. So hopefully from all of those perspectives, we're setting ourselves up well to be prepared, because I don't think this year is going to give us a break in terms of fires, unfortunately.
So do you know to what extent that plan was put together in collaboration with PG&E and other utilities around the transmission and distribution?
Yeah, so our utility district up here is Liberty for most of the basin, and they were definitely a partner in that.
Yeah, seems like that seems to be one of the biggest risks.
Definitely. This is a good question. So I think we have a pretty good partnership in Tahoe with the utility district up here.
Awesome. Well, I don't have any more questions. Anybody else on the phone have questions? I've been reading from the chat, but if anybody wants to just chime in, you're also welcome to. And if you can't unmute yourself, I can certainly help. But
yeah, and don't hesitate to connect with me if you think of anything after this conversation, or when you're visiting Tahoe, make sure to download the Citizen Science app and help us be a Tahoe Blue Gooder. All of that information is on our website, which is just keeptahoeblue.org. Easy to find. And it's fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Darcie. I think this was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me back.
It was really interesting to hear the differences between sort of last year's presentation and what we've learned over the last year, because it's
we just didn't know where to go, and I'm really interested to see in the next couple of years where things go, what trends last, and what we learned from. I'm also excited for all of the new locals, so reach out to me. I'd love to hang out and come visit our office.
Awesome. Well, I will stop the recording.